Nolan Beckett had not even reached the elevator inside the company he founded when security tackled him to the marble floor and locked cuffs around his wrists. Marissa Vance, the woman now sitting in his old chair, told the stunned lobby he was an intruder caught stealing corporate secrets. What none of them knew was that the quiet man being dragged out still legally controlled the entire company, and that this arrest was the final piece of a plan built to erase him for good. Just as the patrol car doors swung open, a black government convoy pulled up outside, and United States Attorney Helena Crowley stepped out holding evidence that was about to unravel everything. For nearly 2 decades, Nolan had built his reputation on discretion rather than spectacle, avoiding magazine profiles, declining television interviews, and letting the machines his company designed speak for themselves inside hospitals' power, plants and water treatment facilities across the Sentinel country. He had raised his household alone for a long stretch of years, after a painful personal loss, and though that chapter of his life had long since settled into quiet stability, it had taught him something about patience that no business school could ever teach. He believed a company much like a family built on shared sacrifice survived not on charisma or bold promises, but on the steady accumulation of trust, earned one honest decision at a time. That belief was exactly what made him vulnerable. The moment he stepped away because he had spent so many years quietly assuming that loyalty could never truly be manufactured, only earned through time. On a gray Monday morning, Nolan drove his old pickup truck to Beckett Meridian Systems. Instead of taking the company car he was entitled to use. He wore a plain jacket, carried a worn leather briefcase, and tucked inside it was a sealed envelope containing shareholder authorization documents he had not shown to a single soul. 8 months had passed since he last walked through those doors, and he had come back only because a trusted contact warned him that Marissa intended to sell the company's core infrastructure division to a foreign conglomerate called Orbis Dominion for a fraction of its true worth. He told no one he was coming because he suspected the internal communication systems were no longer safe to use. At the front desk, his badge was rejected by a receptionist who had never heard his name, and on the wall of honor where his portrait once hung, there was now a photograph of Marissa, beneath the words "Founding Visionary" of the new Beckett Meridian. Wade Prescott arrived with 6 security officers before Nolan had taken 10 steps past the lobby doors. Wade declared that Nolan was trespassing and was suspected of stealing confidential trade secrets, and he refused every request Nolan made to call independent counsel or verify the ownership records on file. He tore the briefcase from Nolan's hands and gave the order to force him down, and within seconds, hundreds of employees had gathered around the atrium, some raising their phones to record what was happening. A handful of longtime staff recognized the founder instantly, yet not one of them dared speak because dozens of people loyal to Nolan had already been quietly pushed out under Marissa's new regime. When Marissa finally emerged from her private elevator, in a crisp white suit, trailed by an internal communications team, she told the crowd that the man on the floor was a bitter former consultant trying to sabotage the company he no longer had any claim to. Nolan lifted his head and looked her directly in the eyes before he spoke. He told her that she could change the name on the door, but she could never change who actually owned the building it hung on. Wade opened the briefcase and pulled out a hard drive loaded with classified data, and Nolan immediately recognized that the device had never belonged to him in the first place. Marissa announced that the police had already been called ahead of time, a detail that told Nolan the entire arrest had been planned days, maybe weeks in advance. 2 local officers arrived and locked handcuffs around his wrists, while Wade claimed there was footage proving Nolan had accessed the system using a stolen employee login. As he was walked toward the exit, Nolan caught sight of Tessa Monroe standing on the second-floor balcony above the atrium. She said nothing, but her hand rose quietly to touch a small compass pendant around her neck, a private signal the 2 of them had used for years that meant, "Do not trust what you are seeing." Just as officers pushed him toward the waiting patrol car, a line of black government vehicles pulled up outside the building, and Helena Crowley stepped out, holding up federal credentials, ordering the local police to hold their position before anyone left the property. Marissa smiled, assuming the federal attorney had arrived to formally charge Nolan with technology theft on a national scale. Instead, Helena walked straight past him and looked at Marissa with an expression that made the color drain from her face, telling her plainly that she had not come for Mr. Beckett, but for the $860 million transaction Marissa intended to finalize at 10 o'clock that morning. 8 months earlier, Nolan had stepped back from daily operations because his father needed long-term medical care, and he handed temporary leadership to Marissa, whose record of expanding new markets had impressed the entire board. He transferred operational authority, only never ownership, never voting control. But Marissa played the part of a devoted steward so convincingly that even seasoned executives believed she intended to protect his legacy. The moment he was gone, she began systematically removing anyone who had ever shown him personal loyalty, replacing the head of human resources, the head of security, and several members of internal legal counsel within a matter of weeks. Longtime engineers were reassigned to distant facilities, pressured into resigning or accused of violations that never actually occurred, clearing the floor of anyone who might question her authority. She installed Wade Prescott as director of security, a former police officer who had been forced out of the department years earlier for falsifying reports, and gave him full control over surveillance footage, badge access, and every internal record of who entered the building and when. Graham Keaton, the company's chief legal counsel, appeared neutral to outsiders, but was in truth the architect behind the entire takeover. He quietly formed 3 shell entities: Vance Strategic Holdings, Meridian Renewal Trust, and Northbridge Asset Partners, and routed portions of company equity through each one to obscure who truly stood to benefit. Marissa then produced a resignation letter bearing what looked like Nolan's exact signature, claiming he had permanently stepped down and transferred all voting rights to the board of directors. The forgery was convincing because Graham had pulled signature samples from hundreds of old documents, and a paid notary was brought in to swear she had personally witnessed Nolan signing it in her office. Victor Langford, the board chairman, called an emergency closed-door session and formally recognized Marissa as chief executive, brushing aside every objection Tessa raised, while Graham threatened to expose falsified accounting records under her name if she kept pushing back. Wade had been drawn into Marissa's orbit through a mutual acquaintance who promised him a chance to rebuild a career that had collapsed years earlier over a falsified evidence report. He told himself quietly and repeatedly that he was simply providing security for a company undergoing a difficult transition, not knowingly helping orchestrate the removal of the very man who had built it from nothing. Every camera blind spot he engineered, every badge log he quietly altered, felt to him at first like a small favor rather than a crime, until the small favors accumulated into something he could no longer walk away from. Marissa paid him well, and reminded him often that Nolan's return would mean the end of both their positions, a warning that kept Wade compliant long after his conscience began to protest. Marissa never intended to run Beckett Meridian for the long haul. Her real target was the sale of the company's infrastructure control systems, technology already embedded in hospitals, municipal water networks, and several federal facilities across the country, which meant any legitimate sale required strict national security review. She and Graham deliberately split the transaction into smaller pieces to avoid triggering that review, pricing a division worth an estimated $2.4 billion at only $860 million, while a hidden payment was arranged to land quietly in an offshore account under her control. Nolan first noticed something was wrong when royalty payments from his personal patents stopped flowing into the research fund he had established years earlier. When he called the company directly, no one would connect him to Marissa. His email access had been revoked. His board credentials were disabled, and his own attorney received a notice claiming he had already sold his shares. Understanding that any public confrontation too soon would give Marissa time to destroy evidence, Nolan chose to walk back into the company as though he still had no idea how far the conspiracy had gone. In the interrogation room, Helena had not yet revealed which side she believed, and she pressed Nolan to explain how a classified hard drive ended up inside his own briefcase. Nolan explained that the case had been separated from him for roughly 40 seconds, while Wade conducted a routine security check more than enough time to plant a device inside it. Helena told him the lobby cameras showed him holding the briefcase continuously, but Nolan pointed to a specific gap 38 seconds, where the crowd blocked the camera's angle entirely, and he suspected Wade had edited the footage before ever handing it to police. Helena laid out the documents stacked against him one by one: a signed resignation letter, a record transferring his voting rights, a stock sale agreement, a recorded phone call in which his voice confirmed he was walking away from the company forever, and even medical records suggesting cognitive decline. Nolan recognized instantly that the recorded voice had been generated using audio synthesis technology, and the medical file came from a clinic he had never once set foot inside. Every piece of evidence had been engineered to paint him as an unstable aging founder, trying to reclaim a company he had voluntarily abandoned. Helena admitted that several of the falsified contracts had been signed from an internet connection registered to his own home, and suspicious payments had also passed through an account bearing his name, which meant she could not yet fully trust him either. She revealed that federal investigators had already been examining Beckett Meridian for signs of contract fraud and unauthorized technology transfer, and if Nolan could not prove he had been framed, he was facing the possibility of decades behind bars. Nolan then revealed the one safeguard Marissa never knew existed. Years earlier, he had placed 31% of the company's voting shares into an irrevocable trust called the Meridian Stewardship Trust, a structure known only to himself and a single independent custodian. Its trigger clause was simple but absolute: any evidence of coercion, forgery, or unauthorized technology transfer would automatically return full voting control to the founder. Marissa could forge personal transfer documents in Nolan's name, but she could never legally move shares locked inside a trust she did not even know about. The only problem was that the original signed trust agreement was sitting inside a safe buried beneath the very headquarters building where the entire scheme was unfolding. Helena had been building a case against irregularities at Beckett Meridian for nearly 4 months before Nolan ever walked through those doors that morning, tracing a pattern of suspicious wire transfers that first surfaced during an unrelated review of a federal contracting dispute. What began as a minor discrepancy in a supplier ledger eventually widened into a sprawling investigation, touching offshore accounts, shell entities, and a takeover that looked increasingly less like a corporate restructuring and more like an outright theft. She had not anticipated the founder himself walking straight into the middle of it, handcuffed on the same morning she intended to finally move against Marissa. But she recognized immediately that his arrival, however chaotic, might accelerate everything her team had spent months assembling. Helena refused to release Nolan immediately, knowing that doing so would put Marissa on high alert before the trust could be verified. She proposed keeping the public appearance of Nolan as a suspect, while her team secretly confirmed the trust's authenticity, and Nolan agreed on one condition: that no innocent employee be arrested, simply to apply pressure on him. Helena realized in that moment that even after being handcuffed by his own staff, Nolan was still trying to protect the people who worked for him. Her phone rang with an update from the agents already inside the building, and the news stopped her cold. The underground safe had been opened before her team ever arrived. The original Meridian Stewardship Trust agreement was gone, and the last person recorded entering that vault was Tessa Monroe. Helena showed Nolan the footage of Tessa opening the vault at 17 minutes past 5 in the morning, removing a thick envelope, and walking away without hesitation. Nolan refused to believe Tessa had betrayed him, recalling that she had once turned down a salary 3 times higher elsewhere just to stay with the company through its hardest years. Still, the badge access logs and the clear facial recognition match were undeniable on paper, and Helena reminded him that loyalty was not admissible evidence in a courtroom. The story shifted to what Tessa had endured over the previous months, forced by Marissa to sign financial statements she knew were falsified, while quietly preserving copies inside an old accounting system Marissa did not even know still existed. Tessa had discovered that $74 million had been funneled to fabricated vendors, several of which shared registered addresses with Graham's shell companies. When Tessa finally refused to sign the final transaction, Wade showed her photographs, proving someone had been surveilling her home, warning that she would be framed as the lead suspect if she kept resisting. Knowing Marissa intended to finalize the Orbis Dominion sale, that Monday morning Tessa feared Graham would destroy the trust document the moment he found it, so she removed it from the vault before he could. Rather than take it home, she hid the envelope somewhere only Nolan could ever guess, inside the metal frame of the very first prototype machine the two of them had built together decades earlier, now sitting on display in the company's history museum on the 18th floor. She had tried signaling him with the compass pendant in the lobby, but with Wade watching her every move, she never had the chance to say a single word. Once, federal agents locked down the boardroom where the sale contract was waiting. Marissa ordered Wade to hunt down Tessa immediately, and Graham warned that if federal investigators found the missing trust first, Marissa's entire claim to the company would collapse in an instant. Marissa sealed off the 18th floor under the pretense of protecting historical artifacts, then sent Tessa a direct threat, promising to release the falsified financial files unless the document was handed over. Tessa pretended to agree to meet her in the archive room, buying herself just enough time to think. Nolan remembered that the compass symbol traced back to the company's earliest days engraved on that same prototype machine with the words, "When you lose direction, return to where it began." He told Helena the missing trust was likely hidden inside that museum display, and a team of agents rushed toward the 18th floor, only to find the elevator locked down remotely, with Wade claiming there was an unexplained electrical malfunction on that level. Tessa arrived at the archive room to find Marissa and Graham already waiting for her. Marissa slid a pre-written confession across the table, one that placed the entire financial fraud squarely on Tessa's shoulders, and gave her a simple choice: sign it, or be permanently painted as the woman who stole $74 million. Tessa picked up the pen, but instead of signing, she looked Marissa directly in the eyes and told her she had made a critical mistake, believing Nolan had returned to reclaim his company. In truth, he had returned to see who among them still deserved to stay. Tessa stalled by pretending to break down emotionally, asking for time to read the confession slowly, while secretly activating a recording function hidden inside her smartwatch. Marissa, growing impatient, let slip that it was Graham who had built the false accounts under Tessa's name, and she added coldly that Nolan would never walk out of that interrogation room a free man again. The confession alone was not enough to secure an indictment, but it gave Helena's team justification to expand the search warrant. Wade reviewed the camera logs and noticed Tessa had lingered near the original prototype, and after pulling the display panel loose, he found the envelope containing the original trust agreement exactly where she had hidden it. Just as he prepared to deliver it to Marissa, his phone rang with a call from Helena, informing him that he was now personally under investigation for obstructing a federal case. Helena offered him a path toward leniency in exchange for cooperation, but Wade refused, still convinced Marissa would protect him, though he quietly photographed every page of the document as insurance before handing the original over to Graham. Helena made the decision to bring Nolan back into the building, still visibly restrained under the official pretense of identifying stolen data. In truth, she wanted to watch Marissa's reaction and force her into a mistake under pressure. As Nolan crossed the lobby a second time, several employees lowered their eyes in shame, and a longtime engineer named Everett Sloan stood up and addressed him openly as Mr. Beckett, publicly acknowledging him as the true founder in front of everyone. Wade demanded Everett be fired on the spot, but the federal agents present stopped him immediately. Inside the boardroom, Marissa insisted Nolan had already sold his shares and held no remaining authority, and Nolan responded by asking her 3 direct questions: who approved the transfer of $74 million, why the Orbit Dominion contract had been split into 9 separate smaller transactions, and how his digital signature could have been generated after his security certificate had already expired. Marissa dodged every question while Graham accused Nolan of trying to create chaos in the room. Nolan calmly explained that his digital certificate relied on a physical authentication key that had never once left his personal safe, meaning any contract signed after its expiration date was necessarily fraudulent. Helena then delivered her first public blow, announcing an immediate hold on the Orbis Dominion transaction due to suspected violations of federal investment review law and contract fraud. Marissa reacted with visible panic, accidentally revealing that a deposit had already moved into an account Helena had never mentioned aloud. The room fell completely silent, as Helena asked her plainly how she could possibly have known which account was under surveillance. Graham realized in that instant that Marissa had just tied herself directly to the secret transaction, and he quietly messaged Wade to prepare a car and travel documents. Amid the confusion, Wade sent photographs of the trust agreement to an unknown phone number, believing he was contacting Marissa's people, but the recipient was actually an undercover agent embedded in Helena's team from the very beginning. Helena later confided in Nolan that Wade had first been approached 3 weeks earlier, refusing to cooperate at first until he realized Marissa intended to make him the sole scapegoat for the entire scheme. Even then, Helena withheld full trust in him, using his information only to verify evidence already gathered independently. Wade had photographed the trust to prove its existence, while still holding the physical original as leverage for a full grant of immunity. By this point, Helena already had strong evidence of falsified documents and suspicious transfers. But she still needed absolute proof of who was truly directing the conspiracy, Marissa or Graham. She needed one of them to take a final, unmistakable action, destroying the trust, completing the illegal sale, or directly threatening a cooperating witness. And Nolan's public return had accelerated Marissa's plans faster than anyone expected. Nolan realized almost too late that his own arrest had unintentionally become the perfect trap. Marissa called an emergency press conference inside the building, telling reporters the company was being harassed by an unstable former executive and overreaching federal agencies. She released footage of Nolan's arrest to the public, causing the company's stock to plunge, calculating that a falling stock price would push the board toward approving the sale as the only path to protecting shareholder value. Victor Langford scheduled an emergency vote for that same afternoon, intending to permanently confirm Marissa as chief executive and strip Nolan of any remaining authority. Nolan proposed letting the vote proceed rather than pushing for an immediate arrest, reasoning that if Marissa used forged documents to seize control in front of the entire shareholder base, it would stand as undeniable evidence of criminal intent. Helena agreed, though she warned that Nolan could still lose the company entirely if they failed to recover the missing trust before voting began. Meanwhile, Tessa escaped the archive room when a team of agents arrived to search the floor, immediately sending Helena the recording she had captured earlier. In it, Marissa could be heard discussing the offshore account, fabricating evidence against Nolan, and planning to frame Tessa for the financial fraud entirely on her own. Hearing federal sirens outside, Graham began to panic and urged Marissa to cancel the vote and flee the country immediately, but she refused, convinced that a second confirmation from the board would provide additional legal protection. Wade called Helena, directly demanding full immunity in exchange for the original trust document. Helena refused to guarantee anything before the document was physically in her possession, and Wade agreed to deliver it in an underground parking structure within 10 minutes. When agents arrived at the meeting point, they found only Wade's car, engulfed in flames, with both Wade and the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case nowhere to be found. Hundreds of shareholders, attorneys, and company representatives gathered inside the main auditorium as Marissa transformed the emergency vote into a carefully staged performance of authority. She told the room Nolan had voluntarily resigned months earlier, only to return in an unstable state and attempt to steal corporate data. Victor announced that the vote would decide three matters at once: whether to confirm Marissa as permanent chief executive, whether to strip Nolan of all remaining access, and whether to approve the sale of the infrastructure division to Orbis Dominion. Helena allowed Nolan's handcuffs to be removed, though he remained under close watch, and he walked onto that stage in the same wrinkled clothes he had worn through hours of interrogation. Marissa mocked him openly, telling the room he no longer had any right to speak. The room grew tense as Marissa's own attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the momentum in the room had begun to turn before a single vote had even been tallied. Cameras from local news outlets invited earlier that morning by Marissa's own communications team to broadcast what she believed would be her formal coronation now captured every word of the unraveling instead. Nolan lifted an old paper stock certificate, worth exactly $1, the very first share ever issued by Beckett Meridian, and briefly recalled how the company had started in a rented warehouse, with 3 folding tables, and a loan no bank in the city wanted to approve. He asked for no sympathy from anyone in the room, only one honest question in return: why would a legitimately elected chief executive need to have the founder arrested before a shareholder vote could even take place? Everett Sloan stood and publicly confirmed that the access system had been altered to erase every record of Nolan's identity. A records manager named Laurel Finch presented server logs proving Nolan's account credentials had been activated from Wade's office at a time when Nolan was verifiably in another state entirely. Tessa walked into the auditorium despite Marissa's earlier order to have her fired and laid out documented proof of the transfers made to the shell companies, prompting Marissa to insist that every one of them was simply a disgruntled employee conspiring with Nolan against her. The vote proceeded, and without the recovered trust in hand, Nolan controlled only the shares he had publicly declared, leaving Marissa and Victor with what appeared to be a commanding lead. Early results showed 46% in favor of Marissa, 39% in favor of Nolan, and 15% still contested over disputed ownership records. Marissa demanded the disputed 15% be counted toward the board's position, citing the forged transfer document bearing Nolan's signature, and since the fraud had not yet been formally proven, Helena had no legal grounds to intervene in a private corporate vote. Nolan asked Marissa directly where the original transfer document was being kept, and she claimed it was locked inside Graham's personal safe. Earlier that same day, however, Graham had told federal agents the document had actually been signed inside Victor's office, and the contradiction sent a wave of confusion rippling across the auditorium. Nolan pressed further, asking how a notarized document could show him signing at 2 in the afternoon in Pittsburgh, when flight records placed him hundreds of miles away in Montana at that exact hour. Marissa's composure finally cracked, and she snapped that it did not matter where he had actually been, because they possessed his signature regardless, a statement that revealed she knew the signature existed, even though Nolan himself had never put pen to paper. Just as Victor prepared to announce the final result, the auditorium doors burst open. Wade stumbled inside, bruised but very much alive, clutching the original trust document in one hand and a small recording device in the other. He looked directly at Marissa and told her that she had paid to have him burned inside that car, and that whatever arrangement they once had was now finished for good. Wade confessed openly that Marissa had personally ordered him to plant the hard drive inside Nolan's briefcase and alter the security footage to support the fabricated arrest. Once he realized she intended to have someone from Orbis Dominion stage the car explosion to eliminate him as a loose end, he escaped moments before the vehicle caught fire and carried the trust document straight to the auditorium in exchange for protection. Helena had the document examined immediately, and the notary seal security paper and registration code all matched the records held by the independent custodian. The Meridian Stewardship Trust controlled 31% of total voting shares, and its trigger clause activated the instant forged documents were used to seize corporate control. The moment Marissa relied on falsified paperwork to claim authority, every share inside that trust automatically reverted to Nolan, giving him 54% of total voting power, and confirming that Marissa had never legitimately held the position of chief executive at any point. Nolan rose to his feet and formally ended Marissa's fraudulent tenure right there in front of every shareholder in the room. Helena stepped onto the stage and read the charges aloud, one by one. Conspiracy to commit securities, fraud, forgery of corporate documents, electronic identity theft, money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation, witness intimidation, unauthorized transfer of strategic technology, conspiracy to harm an individual cooperating with law enforcement. Federal agents moved through the room, sealing every exit before anyone could leave. Marissa tried to shift blame entirely onto Graham, insisting she had merely followed his legal advice, but Helena played the recording Tessa had captured earlier, in which Marissa was heard directly ordering the creation of falsified records and declaring that Nolan needed to be turned into a criminal. A second recording followed this one, captured by Wade's device, in which Marissa promised him payment for destroying the trust document and permanently dealing with Nolan. Graham immediately offered full cooperation, surrendering encryption keys tied to several offshore accounts linked to the scheme. Marissa turned desperately toward Victor for protection, but he denied any involvement until Helena revealed a paper trail showing $12 million had been transferred into his own private fund. Victor was arrested on the spot, and Graham was handcuffed shortly after confirming he had personally forged Nolan's signature on multiple documents. Helena finally approached Marissa and read her rights aloud in front of the entire room of employees and shareholders. As Marissa turned to Nolan and asked why he had not stopped his own arrest from the very beginning if he already suspected what was happening, Nolan answered simply that he needed everyone present to witness exactly what she was willing to do once she believed no one left had the power to stop her. Marissa was led out through the same atrium where Nolan had once been forced to the ground, and this time not a single person in that room turned away. In the immediate aftermath, trading in Beckett Meridian stock was suspended, several bank accounts connected to the scheme were frozen, and the Orbis Dominion sale was formally canceled. More than 20 senior executives were placed under investigation, and employees across the company grew anxious, fearing bankruptcy or a forced breakup of the business they had spent years building. The remaining board members urged Nolan to reclaim the chief executive position immediately, but he refused to answer right away, telling them the true failure was not limited to Marissa alone but to a culture that had allowed hundreds of people to stay silent while their founder was arrested in front of them. A group of longtime staff approached him privately to apologize, explaining that Marissa had convinced nearly everyone he had abandoned the company entirely. Nolan showed no anger, only asked why none of them had spoken up once they realized the accusations against him were false. Everett admitted that fear of losing their jobs had kept them quiet, and Nolan responded that fear could explain silence, but it could never make that silence right. Rather than dismiss the staff who had stayed quiet, he ordered an independent review of each individual case before any final decisions were made. Helena confirmed that Tessa had acted as a cooperating witness throughout the entire ordeal, not as a conspirator, and that the falsified financial records bearing her name had all originated from devices controlled by Graham. Nolan offered her the position of interim chief executive, and though she initially hesitated, feeling she had not been brave enough to challenge Marissa sooner, Nolan told her that true courage was never about the absence of fear, but about protecting the truth despite it. Tessa accepted the role on the condition that the company establish an independent ethics committee moving forward. Wade, despite his cooperation, still faced serious consequences for planting false evidence, orchestrating an unlawful arrest, and threatening employees under his authority, and Helena made clear she could not offer him complete immunity. Wade ultimately agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Nolan neither sought leniency on his behalf nor pursued personal retaliation, saying only that Wade would answer for the choices he made. Nolan announced 5 sweeping reforms meant to rebuild the company from the ground up, eliminating any special individual voting authority outside the founder's trust, separating the role of board chairman from chief executive, establishing an independent legal fund to protect whistleblowers, ordering a full 3-year audit of every existing contract, and distributing a share of company profits to longtime employees harmed by the fraud. He committed publicly to keeping the core technology out of foreign hands and to preserving manufacturing operations in Pittsburgh for the foreseeable future. Helena later informed him that investigators had successfully recovered $68 million of the $74 million diverted through the fraudulent vendor accounts. $6 million, however, had been quietly deposited into an account bearing Nolan's own name just before Marissa's arrest, and without a clear explanation, that transaction alone could still expose him to an entirely separate investigation. When Nolan examined the account, he recognized it immediately as an old trust fund created during the company's earliest years. Marissa had deposited the money there specifically to manufacture one final piece of evidence, hoping it would appear that Nolan had personally profited from the very fraud he was fighting to expose. What she never understood was that Nolan had transferred full control of that account years earlier to an employee assistance fund, meaning the $6 million had never been available for his personal use at any point. Bank records confirmed he had no ability to withdraw a single dollar from it, and the final piece of manufactured evidence against him collapsed entirely under scrutiny. Months later, Marissa Graham and Victor stood trial in federal court, with Graham pleading guilty and testifying against Marissa, while Victor accepted a plea deal that stripped him of every asset gained through the scheme. Marissa refused to admit guilt, insisting she had only acted to save a company she believed was failing. But Helena proved in court that the company had remained profitable throughout, and that the below-market sale existed solely to generate a hidden payment for Marissa herself. Jurors watched footage of Nolan's arrest followed immediately by footage of Marissa's arrest captured in that exact same lobby, and the visual symmetry of the two moments left a lasting impression on everyone in the courtroom. Prosecutors walked the jury through bank transfers, forged signatures, and altered security logs with a precision that left almost no room for doubt, while Marissa's own recorded voice played twice more during closing arguments undercut every claim her defense attempted to make. Graham's testimony, delivered in a flat and exhausted tone, confirmed detail after detail that matched what Tessa and Wade had already provided independently, closing off any possibility that the case rested on a single unreliable witness. In the end, she was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to a lengthy term in prison, closing a chapter that had cost the company its reputation, its stock value, and nearly its founder's freedom. The city and the company later held a small ceremony to formally restore Nolan's name to the building, though he declined any statue or oversized portrait in his honor. Instead, he asked for a modest plaque near the entrance, reading simply that no title outweighs responsibility, and no power stands above the truth. He also asked that the small scuff mark left on the stone floor where he had once been forced down remain untouched. A quiet reminder of how quickly an organization could lose its way. Tessa was formally elected chief executive by the new board, earning her authority through trust, rather than manipulation, something Marissa had never truly possessed. On her first morning in the role, she walked the production floor rather than staying behind a closed office door, stopping to speak with engineers and line workers whose names Marissa had never bothered to learn during her entire tenure. She ordered a full review of every contract signed under the previous administration, not to punish the company publicly, but to make certain no hidden obligation could resurface months later and threaten the recovery already underway. Nolan accepted the role of honorary chairman, staying involved in long-term direction without returning to daily operations, while Tessa restored research departments that had been gutted and personally invited back employees who had been wrongfully dismissed. Within a year, the infrastructure division that Marissa had tried to sell for a fraction of its worth was generating record contracts of its own, proof that the company had never needed a foreign buyer to survive, only honest leadership, willing to protect what had already been built. Helena met Nolan one final time at the old warehouse, where Beckett Meridian had first begun asking why he had chosen not to reclaim the chief executive position after regaining full control of the company. Nolan told her his goal had never been to sit in the highest chair, only to make certain that chair never again belonged to someone willing to destroy everything just to claim it. Helena remarked that the entire case had succeeded largely because Nolan showed enough patience not to seek revenge in a moment of anger. Nolan replied quietly that revenge only makes a defeated person suffer, while true justice stops them from creating any more victims. Some weeks later, Nolan walked into the main atrium of Beckett Meridian, once again this time, with no escort, no press waiting outside, and no security officer standing in his path. His old badge beeped softly against the sensor, and the door opened without hesitation. Employees did not break into loud applause. They simply rose quietly from their desks, a gesture far more sincere than any formal ceremony could ever be. Nolan paused briefly at the exact spot where he had once been pinned to the floor, glanced up at the small plaque bearing his words, and continued walking toward the research wing beyond. He had not returned to rule over an empire built on fear and forged signatures. He had returned to build it again, this time on something no one could ever steal. Years later, people who worked inside Beckett Meridian would still point out the faint scuff mark on the atrium floor to new employees, telling the story not as a warning about ambition, but as a reminder of what happens when an institution forgets who it actually belongs to. The company that emerged from the wreckage of Marissa's scheme was smaller in some ways, more cautious, more transparent, and far less impressed by confident speeches from executives who had never once picked up a wrench or signed a payroll check with their own hand. Nolan spent most of his remaining working years in the research wing, where he had always felt most at home, occasionally walking past the plaque near the entrance, without ever stopping to read it again because he no longer needed reminding of what it said. The truth, once buried under forged signatures and borrowed titles, had done exactly what truth tends to do when given enough time and enough people willing to risk everything to protect it. It had simply outlasted the lie.